WTF? You're on the series What the Future? What the Future aims to dive deep into hot topics that you, the youth, may be scratching your heads about.
Basically, we ask tough questions so you don't have to.
What the? What's up, guys? And thank you for joining us on another episode of WTF? What the Future? What the Future is a podcast series by the National Youth Council's Asia Ready Exposure Program in partnership with the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Today, we're going to be unpacking something that is, I don't think we understand much about it, but thankfully we have some experts here. I'll give you the topic. Global geopolitics. Define it.
It is basically politics about where the countries are placed on the earth.
Actually, I think I saw that on Wikipedia.
So you actually did research?
You did the same thing, right? You went on Wikipedia.
I just guessed.
But yes, I think that's, pretty much the broad sense of what it is. But breaking it down into what's currently happening in the world right now in terms of global geopolitics and also, covering a bit of the U.S. China rivalry that we grew up in, right?
Yeah.
And it's still happening right now.
Yep. So in this episode, we're going to speak to the experts of geopolitics. Obviously, not us, but we're going to discuss some of the economic impacts on the region and what to expect moving forward.
Okay, joining us in the studio here today, we've got Assistant Professor at NTU's Public Policy and Global Affairs, Dylan Low.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
We also have here Channel News Asia Executive Producer, Miss Pearl Forss. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Welcome.
Okay, so our first question is obviously, how do you get into your field and what piqued your interest in your field of studies and your field of work?
So, I studied sociology and economics at NUS, and how I got interested in China, it was actually very accidental. So, in the second year of my university, which is all the way back in 2001, there was a travelogue that was going to be shot in China, and they were auditioning for people. And I was like, yeah, free travels to China. I want to do this, right? So I signed up for it, and then I spent 2 months in China doing all kinds of fun things, like going to Shaolin Temple, like Kung Fu, climbing Mount Ermei, visiting different cities. And they were so open and welcoming to foreign ideas, to talking to foreigners, to engaging. And I just fell in love with China. And so, of course, you don't go from being a fresh grad to immediately becoming a documentary producer. So after I graduated 2 years later, I joined the CNA, worked in the local news desk, and then I worked for a couple of different production houses. And I went back to China in 2008 to make my first China-related documentary, and I haven't stopped since then.
That's incredible. Well,
it was amazing.
Pearl, it sounds like you've had really quite the journey, in your career. What about you, Dylan? How did you get into this field of work?
Very difficult to top what you have just said. After
not a
what I said,
competition.
everything will pale in comparison. Mine is really very unexciting. So when I did my undergraduate in sociology too at NTU, but from my first year in undergraduate, I knew I wanted to go into academia because I just loved research. It helped that I had a lot of inspiring profs as well. After my undergraduate, I went to do my master's at RSIS, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. There, I worked for the then Dean and former Ambassador Barry Desker. It was when it really opened my eyes participating in some of these Track 1 or Track 1.2, which is what we call meetings below the official levels, where I had the chance to interact, speak with Chinese interlocutors. And that really made me very interested because even at that time, I could see how some of their practices were slightly different from the rest. And that really made me very interested in developing a topic around China. It helped that my boss back then, former Ambassador Barry Desker, was very welcoming, encouraging. In fact, he said that go and develop your research topic. And I formulated my research topic around China's diplomats back then. This was before the whole wolf warrior diplomacy we see now. I was very interested in Chinese diplomacy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just because it's like a black box, not been studied a lot, even within the academic literature. Not a lot of people know what they do, their effect on China's foreign policy, or they have this very traditional view of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs being fairly weak in the Chinese domestic system. But what I found actually was not the case. So after RSIS, I got a scholarship to do my PhD at Cambridge, came back to NTU in 2019, and here I am.
You've tried a lot of different things,
Yes.
and you kind of chose something that you're very passionate
Yeah.
about, right? And I'm very glad the both of you are speaking with such, vibrancy about it. We need it today.
We do, we
Yes,
do.
because we're going to be discussing, in this first part, the Sino-US rivalry, right? This is something that has been described as the most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century, and the situation between both countries has always been complicated and complex. But in the last decade or so, it seems like it's become more tense. Why do you guys think it's become, the tensions are running so high?
It's very, very complex, as you pointed out, and there's a lot to unpack. And I could sit here and talk for 10 hours, but I wouldn't. If I had to break it down into just one reason why the US is upset with China and one reason why China is upset with the US, amongst the various factors, it would be this. Okay, so we all remember President Trump, right? Yeah. And in 2016, when President Trump was running for presidency, he went to a lot of these Rust Belt states or Middle America and ran a campaign that said, make America great again, stop letting China steal our jobs. And remember what happened? He won. And we have to understand the historical background of that, which is that when China joined the WTO, China became the factory of the world. I'm pretty sure the clothes I'm wearing right now, something's made in
Yeah,
China,
for sure.
But when everything is made in China, what happens to the American cities and American people who used to make those same things?
The manufacturers. and
Yes,
the- right.
right. So for many, many years, what we've seen is that there's been a hollowing out of the American middle class when all these factories shift to China, and to be fair, to other places in the world, but many of them to China. You have the collapse of certain cities. So I filmed in Dayton, Ohio. I also filmed in Detroit, and you go there and you see these big factories abandoned, the communities around there jobless. So people are angry and they're upset. And when you have Trump coming in 2016 and saying, make America great again, stop China from unfair trade practices and currency manipulation and all of that, it resounded with people. And then he started the trade war after that. And by the way, those tariffs that were implemented as part of the trade war, a lot of them are still around today during Biden's administration. But I want to include this very important thing, which is my personal view, is that is not the full picture. A lot of the job losses were also caused by automation, robots taking over jobs. They also outsourced to a lot of places like Southeast Asia, Mexico, India. So it is not entirely fair at all to blame China for the hollowing out of the middle class and the loss of so many jobs in the US. I think the US also needs to look at their own problems of inequality, how, the very rich are, holding on to a lot of the wealth. But I think many people do hold that view that China's rise has led to a certain degree of economic decline in the States.
So what about
Yeah.
the flip side, right? If
China?
if we're looking from China toward the US.
Okay, all right. Have you guys been to Beijing?
Yes.
Yes. Have you guys visited this place called Yuan?
Yun Ming Yuan.
Yeah, it's like these gorgeous ruins.
Okay.
Okay, so Yuan is called the Garden of Perfect Brightness, and it was the most beautiful thing that China had in the 1800s. Okay, and what happened was that the Western forces came into China at the height of the Opium War, went to Yuan and burned it all down after they looted the place. And this idea of the century of shame that China suffered under the hands of, Western forces, it's very much part of the psyche, everyday psyche of Chinese people. And so after so many decades of working so hard, they finally have their place in the sun. And then you have the US then coming and criticizing them that said, oh, you did this due to currency manipulation, unfair trade practices, and all of that. It really bites, and they reference history a lot. And Hong Kong was another major point, and Hong Kong is related to Yuan and the Opium War and the Century of Shame because they lost Hong Kong during the Century of Shame, right? And then We all remember the massive protests that were happening in Hong Kong. And we have Chinese leaders and the China public believing that the US played a role in that. I'm not saying that that is the correct point of view, but I'm saying that that is quite a popular belief. And it's also something that's been shared by the Chinese leaders. So all those protests mixed with the history of the century of shame, mixed with, the US targeting China as a rivalry for the reasons that I described earlier, all contributes to quite a lot of anger in China.
I wanted to ask you, Dylan, about this as well. Speaking of that, there's always this competition about US being the global superpower, and we know that China is trying to challenge that as well. Do you think that has got anything to play on that whole, China doesn't want to be bullied anymore?
It certainly has. So in international relations, we have this theory called the hegemonic transition theory, which really in a nutshell says that a rising power will challenge the status quo power. And that in return will result in some friction or some tension. And many are pointing to this point in time as that very moment. So to give another analogy, I have 2 young kids at home. So I have my eldest daughter who's like the superpower, sole superpower. And then when my youngest came out, that's like the emerging power. And then you'll very quickly see the superpower, sole superpower, who had hitherto had all the attention, being very unhappy. And this manifests in various ways, tantrums and whatnot. So in that sense, what we are seeing happening in US-China relations, I think speaks to that as well. The US, for the longest time, has believed in and tried to socialize China into the international system to make them more like us. So they do this by various means, trying to introduce democracy, trade, because the idea is that to have flourishing trade, you must have liberal democracy, because the rules underpinning global trade will slowly permeate your society, you become more democratic or more democratic light. It has been very clear that that has not happened. China has proven that you can have authoritarian capitalism. You can have a very capitalist mode of production in the economic sphere with almost zero reforms in the political sphere. And I think during the Obama years, they have reached an inflection point where they realize that, okay, China is not going to be a democracy. They are not going to be like us. We are not going to socialize them to be more in our making. We cannot mold them anymore. What next? That's when the strategy, the pivot to Asia, then subsequently renamed Rebalance to Asia, started to coalesce and concretize. And that has been carried on until the present day.
Let's take it to a bit more of a global scale, right? I mean, we're talking about US, China, and how they view each other, but how does this rivalry then affect the rest of the world?
I point out 2 things. One, the most obvious one, is the deleterious economic effects. When Trump initiated the so-called trade war, you see some of the negative effects being reflected in stock markets, in investor sentiments, in real terms for various economies as well. That has persisted into the Biden administration as well. Of course, what we are experiencing now on the global level is not due only to US-China tensions, but a whole host of other issues, structural issues, war in Ukraine, global inflation. We see some of the runaway ill effects of hyper-globalization manifesting themselves in various ways as well. So we cannot blame entirely all the economic woes we are experiencing only on US-China. But what I have to add is that stable US-China relations in many ways is the precursor to global recovery. Essentially, no economy in the world will be left untouched. When China or US sneezes, the rest of the world will catch a cold. So the economic aspect is very clear, and it's the most, in fact, straightforward. But the second point I want to raise is because of the tension brought on by the US-China relations, there is a sense, I think, a degradation of a sense of security. People just generally feel less secure, they feel less prosperous, they feel that the world is more hostile, less friendlier place. Now, this is felt at both levels. I think at the political level, governments around the world, when they keep speaking in summits or when they make their speeches, keep referring to US-China tensions, it's going to have an effect.
Can we try to simplify this? How will we bring this back to the youth?
Yeah. So I think the economic angle is quite clear. When the global economy is not doing well, Singapore being such an open economy, Singapore will get affected economically as well. So that would have a direct impact on job prospects, wage growth, the kinds of industries that you can participate, maybe even retrenchment. We see a little bit of that in the tech sector. On the second point that I made on general sense of insecurity, I think it affects mentally with what's happening, just this very negative atmosphere of what's taking place around different parts of the world. So all of these, I think, also adds to the anxiety that perhaps youth may face today.
I think social media definitely helps to play a part in that, because you see all this unfold on social media, and as a youth, you're constantly like consuming social media that way. And I feel like that's what you mean by, all that negative energy, they're gonna pick it up from there as well, right?
Yeah, and I will have to add that because social media really demands your attention, short attention span. So when they discuss geopolitics or U.S. China rivalry, this tends to be distilled into very short sound bites that is not historically anchored and that does not allow for a proper, thorough analysis.
So on Pearl's end, right, as a documentary producer, executive producer, what do you think the Sino-US rivalry has like an impact on a global scale?
With regards to how it impacts the globe and the youth, right, I think we can, for me, there are two areas that stand out. First is climate change. Like, we all care about climate change, right? We've seen so many disasters this year, non-stop floods, droughts. And US and China, they are the world's number one and number two, carbon emitters. They need to talk to each other. And I do agree with you on the security aspect of things. Everyone is just more worried about security, and it's not just because of Russia, Ukraine, right? In that AUKUS deal, you have China increasing their military spending, you have Japan increasing their military spending, India as well, and a long list of other countries. And we just came out of a pandemic. There were millions of people impoverished during the pandemic. We have to deal with climate change. There are so many other things that we need to address, and so much money is going to missiles, firearms, and defense.
I think a lot of times the youth are going to think, is war actually going to break out?
That's how it felt for years, actually, that we've been on the brink. Everyone's saying World War III, World War III. I always feel like we're on the brink right there. And at any time, if something happens, we could tip over. Do you guys feel the same way?
I felt it was a bit scary a few months ago, but I think that when President Xi and President Biden met in Bali recently, I think everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Yeah, tensions were taken down.
I guess people, including youths, can maybe appreciate the fact that actually, despite what is happening, honestly, the likelihood of war taking place here is very, very low. And at least statistically, historically, we're actually living in one of the most peaceful periods.
I just became very calm.
You don't need to worry anymore. You don't
sense
need to
of
worry.
calmness.
No, but since we're talking about, here, we're calm here, right? What does this actually have to do with ASEAN itself? Because, are we ever going to be forced to choose a side? Like, is ASEAN going to say, you have to pick the US or you have to pick China? Will it ever boil down to that?
For me, I see the choices being made already. US and China is definitely in various guises. They're not telling ASEAN to say, choose us or them, but in different domains, say whom you choose as your 5G network providers. We are already making the choice. Countries are already making the choice. Even if you do not think of your decision made being choosing US or China, it will be politicized, or you will be seen through that lens, just simply because this whole choose us or choose them discourse or narrative has been so strong in this region and promoted so much by various people. It doesn't help. I guess it helps, but it doesn't help in the sense that ASEAN leaders themselves keep on harping on the fact that please don't ask us to choose. We don't want to choose side. Repeatedly, non-stop, that becomes a cliche. I do have to add that ASEAN is not Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is not ASEAN as well. Southeast Asia is a geographical fact. ASEAN is a social, historical construct. And sometimes we slip in our language between the two, but they are certainly not one and the same. Southeast Asian states, countries in Southeast Asia, have their own calculus. They make their own decisions based on whatever national interests work for them, works for their youth. ASEAN collectively makes certain decisions, but at the same time, they are also inhibited or have to consider what the rest thinks. The rest meaning the 10 member states think. So I think that the dynamic, or there is some distinction between Southeast Asia. and ASEAN. But to answer your question, countries do not want to choose, but in many ways, in choosing in the domains of military, security, economy, whom you do military exercises more, for example, already demonstrates that there are some choices that's being made. But what ASEAN and Southeast Asia does not want to openly do is to make decisions so overwhelmingly clear that they are on China's side.
Here's also what I've seen in Southeast Asia. Like, there are a lot of countries here that maybe they have a security partnership with the US, say Vietnam, for example. Vietnam's security partnership, they do have a partnership with Japan, not one with the US directly, but then they are also part of the Belt and Road. And like in Cambodia, there's a lot of Chinese investments, but they are also seeking out US investments and US companies. So I think that right now, a lot of Southeast Asian nations are choosing to encourage projects from both US, China, as well as from other powers in order, to maintain that state of balance here.
But do you think the youth should be concerned about all these decisions that are being made, that maybe they would feel like, I don't have a say in this? Does that affect them in any way, do you think?
They really have no say. Because let me just put it this way, ASEAN remains a very elite activity. For the youth of Singapore, for example, popular consciousness of ASEAN is very low. It's not helped by the fact that when we think about geopolitics, we think about U.S. China. But very few youths would think about, Indonesian politics matter, Malaysian politics matter, ASEAN politics matter. No, these are unfortunately not the sexy topics that they would consume. Not the stuff that generate headlines that they will read.
Yes.
So that level of awareness of ASEAN is very low, which is unfortunate because it does matter as well for ASEAN itself, for Singapore itself, especially when Singapore very clearly says that ASEAN is a cornerstone of Singapore's foreign policy, but not a lot of youth understand ASEAN. So I think more can be done to encourage mutual understanding of ASEAN countries and the entity itself.
Yeah, I want to add another point, which is that what we are seeing right now as a result of the US-China tensions is also a lot of supply chain restructuring. So there's actually a lot of factories, a lot of manufacturing facilities that are opening up all across Southeast Asia as some companies choose to not have an over-reliance on the China market. So they are hiring a lot of young people across Southeast Asia. So this is another way in which geopolitics really affects the young people of Southeast Asia in their employment opportunities as well.
I like that point because I want to bring it back to what Dylan said as well about, Asian politics not being sexy, right? So what can we do, right, to promote the influence of ASEAN in our institutions or in Singapore?
I think across ASEAN, there needs to be some sort of curriculum introduced in your social studies textbooks at the primary, secondary, and then perhaps tertiary level that at the very least deals a bit more with ASEAN. Because these are our most immediate neighbors and they affect us in a multitude of ways as well. Perhaps some would even say that equally important or perhaps more important than US China as well, because they are our most direct immediate neighbor. So institutionally, at the level of education, I think more can be done. Next is public awareness. This very podcast, I think, is helpful in that regard. In a way that is not a two minute social media post, but also speaks at a level that can hopefully connect with the youth of Singapore as well. Because the youth will be, it's cliche, but the youth will be the leaders of Singapore in the future. They are our future.
But it's very tough to get the youths off of TikTok, where one video is maximum 3 or 5 minutes.
Now got 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. But as you said, politics is not sexy, right?
But I mean, ASEAN is fantastic. I don't see why young people are not more engaged with it. It's not as expensive as traveling to all the way to Europe. I certainly don't have to suffer a long flight. And I really think that we should take advantage of that culture and vibrancy and beauty all around us. And maybe aside from the curriculum, simply more backpacking around the region would do that.
I love to do that.
Absolutely,
So you would say that would be your advice to the youth who want to discover more about ASEAN, about what it's about to travel and go and figure it out by yourself.
For sure. Traveling there, talking to the people there. Maybe you might not be immediately interested in politics, but like getting a sense of, their economic growth, their culture. And then from there, that's a good segue to understanding the politics of the region as well. And it is very interesting once you get into it.
Honestly, I have never been backpacking through Asia.
I have.
Oh, you have? Where have
So,
you gone?
This was my first trip. I'll never ever forget it. I've always wanted a backpack. My mom was like, "You're not going alone." I wanted to go from the south of Thailand, go up through Laos, and then go into Hanoi and down all the way to Ho Chi Minh. And I found that to be exactly like you said, super interesting because you discover things that you normally wouldn't discover. Super, super fun. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to bring back to AEP.
Yeah, absolutely. Because not everybody, is the backpacking sort. For example, me. But the Asia Ready Exposure Program is something that allows the youth to have meaningful exposure to ASEAN states. It gives you that chance. It's a short-term program, right? And it gives you cultural exposure. You get industry experience in places like China or India as well. And you get opportunities beyond Singapore.
Yeah, I also heard that you can actually meet people who have, been in the industry as well. You can speak to them. And for the youth, this is something that is definitely very eye-opening. For me, growing up, I feel like if I had this opportunity, I would definitely jump at it because it's like, opportunity to travel, opportunity to see ASEAN and then be right there and to experience it firsthand. It's very, very different.
So we've talked about, how that affects the youth here in Singapore, right? What about the world? Globally, how does this, geopolitical situation affect the global situation?
Let me tell you about a group of young people that I interviewed for one of my shows. When U.S. China tensions became really bad, I went to the States and spoke to China students who were studying there. The China students form the greatest number of foreign students in the U.S. before the pandemic. So they were in all the different universities and they were paying full fees, okay? And when the geopolitical situation got worse, they had problems with visa renewals. Students that were doing research, one day they were, welcomed, and another day they were seen as spies and saboteurs. So I feel bad. Like it's been quite difficult, for the China youths that are choosing to study in the US. So now, a lot of them are looking at other places to pursue their university studies or research programs, which is a pity. I feel that if the geopolitics were not so bad and relations were better, that definitely the dynamism of the young people of China and the US put together can create some really amazing, scientific breakthroughs and interesting products. Yeah.
That's a very real problem. There's situations where we've got Singaporeans working in China, they couldn't leave for many years and couldn't see their family for many years, and that's because of the policies that are being instituted, right? We've spoken a lot, of course there's more, but I don't think we have the studio for that long. But what's one thing in all your studies and all your research about U.S. China that is not well known, right? But that you feel people should learn about?
Okay, well, let me tell you about one fun thing. We've been, talking about a lot of serious things. So young people are all about, exchange programs. We love applying for that, right? When we're in university. So did you know that when President Xi was young, he was actually on an exchange program to the US? And
Which part of the US?
He went to Iowa.
What?
Yeah. This was when he was already a civil servant. He went to Iowa to learn about farming. And as part of the trip, he stayed in an American citizen's home. Her name is Sarah Lande, and I know her because I spoke to her and interviewed her about this incident. And during the time, he stayed in the bedroom of her teenage son, who was away at college, and the room was full of Star Wars memorabilia.
Don't say that, he's gonna faint.
And interestingly, when he became vice president, he went back to visit that family in Iowa. And that house in Muscatine, Iowa, has since been turned into a China-US friendship house. And Sarah Lande, the lady who hosted him, wrote to him, and he wrote back, and it was carried in Chinese media.
I will add that Xi Jinping's daughter studied at Harvard as well. But then she had to come back when Xi Jinping became president.
I see.
For me, I will just share a small factoid. Did you know that less than 40% of Americans have passport and less than 10% of Chinese have passports? Now, this tells us several things. One is the amount of people that know what's happening outside of US, and for China definitely more so as well, the amount of people in China that knows what's happening outside of China is actually not that great. Second, it means that there is potential, there's scope for more of these sorts of exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, and hopefully that can foster greater mutual understanding on the people-to-people level as well between US and China.
Yeah, because domestically in the US, when you travel, you don't even need a passport. You just need your,
EasyLink
ID. EasyLink card. Nets cash card. Yeah, so absolutely. I think, more of the youth globally could afford to travel to learn about the world, learn about the cultural and historical significance. Like Avery backpacking through all of Asia.
Okay, so before we end, right, let's try and do something. If you guys have a piece of advice to the youth, right, so on geopolitics, what would that be? The easiest piece of advice you have for this day and age for the youth?
Please do not rely on Facebook for news. It's really, really important to not be in an echo chamber, like to read from a wide source. And if you don't have time to read from everyone, at least just read like the local news media. And yeah, don't just depend on your social circles for news and information.
Or watch Prof's documentary.
Documentary.
Well, thanks for the plug.
No, absolutely. I think an echo chamber can be very dangerous, moving forward. Yeah.
Not unlike Paul, I would say spend a bit more time reading things and always be questioning the source, questioning what's being said. Come to your own conclusions after questioning what you read.
Basically, fact check.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising that the media has actually come in a lot in our conversation today. And looking at, the intentions of these media sources, I think is very important as well. You have any advice for the youth?
Travel.
See the world.
See the world. Paul's right. You're not going to get any younger, In our age, people don't really want to step out of their comfort zones and take that big leap of faith to say, I'm going to go and travel. I'm going to go and discover the culture myself. And I think when people do that, they realize that, wow, this is amazing. Like you learn everything firsthand.
Well, mine is not as exciting. I missed the exit on the highway and got stuck in Mexico without a passport and got detained in Tijuana. Yes, that was my experience. So bring your
Do
passport
not forget your
everywhere.
passport.
Buy travel insurance.
Yeah, we have it for a reason. And I think, that's global geopolitics in not really a nutshell, but really a big thank you to Dylan as well as Prof for coming in, for sharing your first-hand experiences, from your years of fieldwork and research. I think the youth will find that very, very interesting.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And to you guys, thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of What the Future, WTF. Remember to visit NYC's Facebook as well as Instagram. Leave your comments. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, but also learn more about the region and go and check out AEP's Asia Radio Exposure Program at utopia.sg.
All right, till next time. Bye.